I was sitting in the pre-op waiting room when the billing coordinator handed me a clipboard and told me she was sorry. The number on the top line was $2,200. That was my share after Medicare. I called my son. He said, "Dad, I just cleared $180,000 in bonuses this quarter." Then he said, "Everything's already committed to the new house renovation. There's nothing I can do right now." His wife said something in the background. The line went quiet. 20 minutes later, my daughter called. She worked checkout at a grocery store. She said, "I've been putting away a little every week. I want you to have it." She didn't know yet what that decision was about to set in motion. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Before we go further, I'd appreciate it if you'd take a moment to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss stories like this one. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're listening from. I love hearing from you. And a quick note, the story you're about to hear blends real-life experience with fictional elements for educational purposes. Any resemblance to specific individuals or locations is purely coincidental, but every lesson in it is earned. My name is Robert Callahan. Most people call me Bob. I spent 32 years as a letter carrier for the United States Postal Service out of Columbus, Ohio. I walked those routes in February cold and July heat, 6 days a week, until my knees gave me a reason to stop, and the retirement paperwork finally gave me permission. I knew every house on 4 routes by name. I knew who got birthday cards and who got collection notices, and who waited by the door every morning just to have someone to say good morning to. I had a heart condition that crept up on me the way most serious things do quietly. Over years, until one morning, it wasn't quiet anymore. The cardiologist in Columbus told me I needed a valve repair. Not optional, not something we could watch and wait on. He said if we didn't schedule it, I was looking at a significant event within months. He used the word significant, the way doctors do when they mean catastrophic. Medicare would cover the bulk of it, but the copay, the facility fees, the anesthesia gap, all of it added up to $2,200 that I needed before they'd put me on the surgical schedule. I had $1,340 in my checking account. I'd been living on my pension since retirement. It covered the mortgage on the house, utilities, groceries, and not much else. My wife, Carol, had passed 14 months earlier from a stroke. She handled our finances. After she was gone, I found out we'd been closer to the edge than I'd understood. My son is a corporate attorney in Chicago. He'd been there 11 years, made partner at 38, lived in a house in Lincoln Park that had a wine cellar and a home gym. I was proud of him the way fathers are when their children exceed what they imagined. I'd worked extra shifts on holidays to help him get through law school. Carol had taken on a second job at a dry cleaner for 2 years. We didn't complain. We wanted him to have the life we couldn't. I hadn't spoken to him in 4 months. Not because we'd fought, just because time passed and we both let it. The way people let things slip when they assume there will always be more time. He called on Christmas and my birthday. I called on his. We'd been doing that for years without either of us saying out loud that it wasn't enough. I called him from the hospital parking lot, sitting in my truck with the engine running. I'd rehearsed what I was going to say. I didn't want it to sound like begging. He answered right away, which surprised me. His voice was upbeat, the kind of upbeat that comes with champagne and validation. I could hear noise in the background. I asked if it was a bad time. He said no. Tell me what's going on. I told him. The valve, the surgery date, the $2,200 gap. There was a pause I recognized. It wasn't the pause of someone thinking. It was the pause of someone deciding how to decline. He said he'd had a big quarter. I already knew that. His firm had sent a press release and one of Carol's cousins had forwarded it to me. $180,000 in performance bonuses. I didn't bring it up. I waited. He said the new house was a money pit. They were redoing the kitchen and the primary bath at the same time, contractor delays, everything running over budget. He said his wife had started a business and they were funding it themselves. He said it wasn't a good time financially, which I understood was not the same thing as saying he didn't have the money. I told him the surgery was scheduled for the following Thursday. I told him they couldn't put me on the calendar without the payment cleared. He said, "Dad, can you look into a payment plan? Most hospitals have them." I told him I had. The payment plan required a $1,500 deposit up front, and I was still short. He said, "I'll see what I can work out and call you this weekend." Then his wife said something I couldn't make out, and he said he had to go. He said he loved me. Then the call ended. I sat in the parking lot for a long time. I looked at the hospital entrance and thought about Carol. She would have known what to do. She always knew what to do. She would have made the calls, worked the numbers, found the path through, and she never would have let either of our children drift this far without doing something about it. I drove home through the west side of Columbus, past the houses on Route 6 where I used to walk my mail rounds, past the corner where Mr. Process Hargrove used to sit on his porch and wave every single morning for 11 years until he didn't anymore, past the elementary school where my daughter learned to read. My daughter is 41. She has 2 kids, a boy of 12 and a girl of 9. She works at a grocery store on Broad Street, 40 hours a week, occasionally picking up a 5th shift when she can get childcare covered. Her kid's father has been out of the picture since the girl was 3. She doesn't talk about him. She moves forward the way people do when they decide the looking back isn't helping anything. She called me that evening. She said she'd heard from her brother. I hadn't told her I was calling him. I suppose he had. She didn't ask me to explain. She said, "How much do you need, Dad?" I told her not to worry about it. She said, "Dad, how much?" I told her. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said she had money put aside. She'd been saving it since Carol died, because she knew I was going to need something at some point, and she wanted to be ready. She asked if she could bring it over. I told her it was her money. I told her she had 2 kids and a mortgage of her own. She said, "You walked mail in 12-degree weather for 32 years so I could have a childhood. Don't tell me what I can and can't do with my own savings." She came over that night, knocked on my door just after 8, still in her work vest because she'd come straight from her shift. She handed me an envelope. Inside was cash, grocery store money, tip jar money, birthday money from people who loved her. She'd been putting away $20 here, $40 there. The way people save when they can't save much, but they refuse to stop trying. There was $1,100 in the envelope. I told her I couldn't. She put her hand over mine and pressed the envelope back toward me. She said, "Mom would want me to." I didn't argue after that. I couldn't. Between what she gave me and what I had, I was still $760 short. I didn't tell her that. She'd already given everything she could put together. I called the billing office the next morning and asked about any assistance programs. They gave me 3 numbers. I called all 3. 2 had wait lists measured in months. 1 required documentation I didn't have time to gather. I hung up and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the envelope and thought about calling my son again. I didn't. The knock on my door came at 11:30 that morning. Terry Okafor stood on my porch. Terry had been a carrier at my station for 24 years. Built like a man who'd walked thousands of miles because he had. He held a white envelope. He said, "Word got around the station." I said, "Terry, you didn't have to." He said, "We took up a collection." Nobody asked twice. He pressed the envelope into my hands. "You trained half the people in that building. You covered routes when people's parents died and when their kids were born and when the weather shut down half the city and everyone else called in. You think we forgot?" Inside the envelope was $620. Bills in mixed denominations, the kind that come from wallets and coat pockets and the bottom of lockers. From people making $35,000, $40,000 a year who still pulled together more than a corporate attorney with a wine cellar. I counted it 3 times. With what my daughter had given me, I had enough. I called the billing office and made the payment. The surgery was scheduled. I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt something settle in me like cold concrete. Not anger, something more permanent than anger. Clarity. My son had said it wasn't a good time. He had renovations. His wife had a startup. There was nothing he could do right now. My daughter came straight from a grocery shift. Terry showed up with an envelope from people who made a quarter of what my son earned. They didn't ask if it was convenient. They showed up. The surgery went well. The cardiologist said the repair was clean, that I had years ahead of me if I took care of myself. I lay in the recovery room and thought about what I was going to do with them. My son called on the Saturday after I got home. He asked how I was feeling. He said he'd been meaning to call. He said he'd heard from my daughter that the surgery went fine and he was relieved. He did not ask how I'd covered the payment. He did not bring it up. He moved on to telling me about the kitchen renovation. I listened. I didn't say much. When he was done, I said I appreciated the call. Then I said I'd be in touch. After I hung up, I got out a notepad and wrote down what I knew and what I didn't know. Carol had handled the household finances. After she passed, I went through her files and found things I didn't understand. A credit account I didn't remember opening. A personal loan from a credit union in Indiana, with my name on it, dated 2020. A balance reported to a credit bureau that I had no memory of incurring. I chalked it up to Carol's record-keeping, to accounts I'd forgotten about, to the fog of grief. But sitting at my kitchen table 2 weeks out of heart surgery, with an envelope of grocery money still on my counter, I decided I didn't want to chalk it up anymore. I called my friend Darnell James. Darnell had retired from the post office 3 years before me and gone to work for a small private investigation firm in Dublin, Ohio. He did background checks, asset searches, insurance fraud cases. He was meticulous and quiet and absolutely without sentiment when it came to facts. I told him what I'd found in Carol's files. I told him about the credit account, the Indiana loan, the credit bureau entry. I told him about my son. Darnell asked me how serious I was. I told him about the envelope on my counter and the people who'd put money into it. He said, "Give me 2 weeks." He called me on a Tuesday morning. He said he needed me to come to his office. I drove to Dublin. Darnell's office was in a converted bungalow near the library. Bookshelves on every wall, organized like a man who found the chaos of the world easier to bear when his files were alphabetical. He had a folder on his desk thick enough to be a textbook. He told me to sit down. He said my son had used my name on 2 financial instruments without my authorization. The first was a personal loan from a credit union in Terre Haute, Indiana, taken out in October 2020 for $48,000. My signature appeared on the cosigner line. I had never been to Terre Haute. I had never opened an account at that credit union. Darnell had compared the signature to my actual signature on 3 separate verified documents, and then hired a handwriting specialist to do the same. The specialist's conclusion was that the signatures were practiced forgeries. Good ones, but forgeries. The second was a revolving credit account opened in my name in March 2021. Limit of $15,000. Balance had been run up and defaulted. It had been on my credit report for 2.5 years. It was why my application for a home equity line after Carol's death had been declined. I'd assumed the decline was income-related. It wasn't. I stared at the documents. My name, my address, my social security number. All of it used without my knowledge to borrow money that was never paid back. Darnell set another document on the table. A bank statement from a business account registered to a limited liability company called Callahan Consulting Group, registered in Delaware. I had no knowledge of this entity's existence. My son was listed as the registered agent. I looked up at Darnell. He said, "He's been running money through it. Nothing criminal on its face without more investigation. But the loan signatures are a different matter. That's fraud. Federal, because of the credit union's FDIC status." My hands were steady. I noticed that. They should have been shaking. I asked him how much the loan had been used for. He showed me the draw history. $48,000, withdrawn in 4 transactions over 6 months in late 2020 and early 2021. That was the year my son and his wife bought their house in Lincoln Park. The house with the wine cellar and the home gym. The house that was now being renovated. I sat there and thought about 32 years of walking routes. About the extra shifts I worked so he could get through law school without debt. About Carol's second job at the dry cleaner. About the look on her face when he made partner and called us from Chicago with champagne in his voice. About how proud she was. How proud we both were. He had used my name, my credit. The reputation I'd spent a lifetime building, one delivered piece of mail at a time. He'd forged my signature and borrowed money in my name, and never once mentioned it. Never once acknowledged what he'd done. Never once considered that it might matter. And when I needed $2,000, $200 to keep my heart beating. He told me it wasn't a good time. I asked Darnell what my options were. He leaned back in his chair. He said I could report it directly to federal authorities. He said I could hire an attorney and pursue civil recovery. He said I could confront my son privately. Or, he said, I could do something less common. He said sometimes people who've been wronged by someone they love want more than legal recourse. They want the person who hurt them to actually see what they did. Not to a stranger. Not in a courtroom. But in front of people who knew both of them. I thought about that for a long moment. I asked Darnell if he still had contacts at the post office Union Hall. He smiled slowly. He said yes. I made 4 phone calls over the next 3 days. The first was to Terry Okafor. I told him what I'd found. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said whatever I needed, whenever I needed it. The second call was to my daughter. I told her there were things she needed to know. She didn't say much. When I finished, she said she'd be wherever I needed her to be. The third call was to a man named Gerald Watts. Gerald was a retired mail carrier from Indianapolis who had worked alongside my son years ago at a summer internship. Back when my son was idealistic, and I still believed I knew who he was. Gerald had his own story about my son. I'd heard pieces of it over the years and dismissed them. I didn't dismiss them anymore. I called Gerald and asked him to come to Columbus. The fourth call was to my son. I told him I needed to see him. I told him it was important. He said he was swamped. I said the word important again, more deliberately. He said he'd come down on a Saturday. I said no. I said I needed him to come the following Thursday evening. I gave him an address. He asked what address it was. I told him it was the Columbus Postal Workers Hall on Livingston Avenue. He asked what this was about. I said it was about family, about what that word actually means. He was quiet. Then he said he'd be there. The hall was nothing special. Folding tables, metal chairs, a podium with a dent in it from some meeting 20 years ago. American flag in the corner. The coffee maker that had been there since I started my career. Probably. On a Thursday evening in November with rain coming down cold and sideways, it was warm inside and full of people who had no obligation to be there except that they'd decided to show up. 51 people came. Terry had reached out to every carrier who'd worked with me over the years. Some were still active. Some had retired. A few had driven from as far as Dayton. My daughter sat in the second row with her 2 kids. Gerald Watts drove 3 hours from Indianapolis and sat near the back with a folder on his lap. Darnell sat beside Gerald. A Union chaplain I'd known for 15 years stood near the wall. My son arrived at 7:15, 15 minutes late. He came in wearing a coat that cost more than a month of my pension. He stopped 3 steps into the room. He looked at the crowd. He looked at me. He said, "Dad, what is this?" I said, "Sit down, son." He sat. Terry stood at the podium. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. He said that the people in that room were there because one of their own had been left behind. He said a man who'd walked rain and ice for 32 years, who'd covered routes when people couldn't come in, who'd trained a generation of carriers, had needed $2,200 for heart surgery. He said that man's son had said it wasn't a good time. He said the man's daughter, who worked a grocery store checkout, had given everything she'd saved. He said the Postal Brotherhood had passed a hat. He said it out loud, in a room full of people, and my son had to sit there and hear it. My son started to say something. Terry looked at him with the particular patience of someone who has held his tongue for a very long time. He said, "In a minute. Right now you're going to listen." He gestured to Darnell. Darnell stood and walked to the front. He introduced himself. He explained that he'd spent 2 weeks examining my finances, my credit history, and my son's business activities at my request. He laid it out plainly, the way investigators do when they've found something solid and they don't need to embellish it. The Indiana loan, my forged signature, $48,000 borrowed in my name to help purchase a house in Chicago. The credit account in my name, defaulted, destroying my credit for years. The LLC registered in Delaware with my son as agent. The room was completely silent. My son's face went through several things. Denial, then calculation, then something that looked like a wall coming down. I stood up. I told the room that when Carol died, I discovered accounts I didn't recognize. I told them I'd assumed it was paperwork I'd missed in my grief. I told them I was wrong about that. I said I spent 32 years building a reputation in this city. I carried mail for people I loved, for people I never met, in weather that should have kept anyone inside, because I believed that showing up was the point. I believed it was the whole point. I turned to my son. I said, "You used my name to borrow money so you could buy a house you couldn't afford. You let it default on my credit. You never said a word. And when I needed $2,200 to have heart surgery, you told me it wasn't a good time." My son looked at the table. Gerald Watts stood up from the back. He said, "My name is Gerald Watts. I worked a summer internship in Columbus 17 years ago. The man who owned the building my employer rented was this man's son." He placed his folder on the table. "I had a business dispute with him. I'm not going to litigate it here tonight. What I'll say is that when I needed help, when things went wrong through no fault of my own, he found a legal path to walk away, and he took it without looking back. I lost $11,000. I was 26 years old, and that was everything I had." He sat back down. My son said, "That settlement was," Terry said, "still not your turn." My daughter stood up. Her voice was quiet, and it filled every corner of that room. She said she worked 40 hours a week at a grocery store. She said she had 2 kids and a mortgage, and she put $20 in an envelope every time she had a slow week and 40 when she had a better one. She said she'd been doing that for 14 months, since her mother died, because she knew her father was going to need something at some point. She said she gave every dollar she'd saved to a man who had needed a heart repair and couldn't cover the gap. She said she gave it because that's what her parents had taught her family was. Not blood, not last names, not holidays when it was convenient. She said, "Family is who picks up when the cost is real." She sat down. The room was quiet. I said, "Son, I have 2 things to say to you, and then you have a decision to make." He looked at me. His eyes were red. I didn't know if it was shame or self-pity. I needed to find out. I said, "First, Darnell has documented everything. The loan, the signatures, the credit account. That documentation goes to a federal attorney if we don't resolve this tonight. You know what that means for a lawyer with a partnership." He nodded once. "Second," I walked toward him slowly. "I don't want your destruction. I want your understanding. There's a difference." He said, "What do you want from me?" I said there were 3 things. The first was that he would make full restitution for the Indiana loan and the credit account. Not to me, not as a transfer, but paid directly into a fund established in Carol's name through the Postal Workers Union. The fund would provide emergency assistance to mail carriers facing medical gaps that their insurance didn't cover. Every carrier in that room knew what it was like to be one bad diagnosis away from a decision no one should have to make. The fund would be permanent, maintained with annual contributions that his firm could afford and that he would commit to in writing tonight. The second was Gerald Watts. He would contact Gerald privately, review what had happened, and settle the $11,000 in a manner that Gerald found acceptable. No lawyers on his side, no negotiations, just what was right. The third was that he would call my daughter every single week for 1 year. Not a text, a phone call, long enough to ask about her kids by name, because she had 2 children who needed to know what their uncle looked like. And she had scraped together every dollar she had for a man that her brother had turned his back on, and she deserved to know that someone in her family was paying attention. He sat there. I said, "Or, if you'd prefer, Darnell makes 1 phone call." My son looked at Darnell. Darnell looked back, without any expression at all. My son looked at his hands on the table. Then he looked at my daughter. She held his gaze without blinking. He said, "I'll do all 3. He said it quietly. No performance in it, just the sound of someone who had run out of road. Gerald walked to the front of the room. He and my son looked at each other across the table. Gerald said, "I don't need an apology. I need it to be right." My son said, "I'll make it right." I believe he meant it. Not because I trusted his character in that moment. I didn't. but because the alternative was everything he'd built, and more importantly, because the room full of people watching him wasn't going to let him forget. The union chaplain spoke briefly. He said that the hardest thing a man can do is stand in front of the people he's failed and not make excuses. He said the second hardest thing is to let someone back in after they've failed you. He said both things were necessary. My son left that night without saying much. He shook my hand at the door. His grip was uncertain in a way I'd never felt from him before. I let him go. The weeks that followed were not easy, and I won't pretend they were. He called Gerald. It took several conversations and a mediator Gerald trusted. In December, a check cleared for $11,000. Gerald sent me a text that said simply, "Thank you." I printed it out and put it next to Carol's picture on the windowsill. My son established the Callahan Medical Relief Fund through the Postal Workers Union. The initial contribution covered the Indiana loan balance, and then some. Terry oversaw the administration. The first recipient was a carrier in Columbus, whose daughter needed surgery for a spinal condition. The fund covered $3,400 in out-of-pocket costs. My son did call my daughter. The first few calls were short and awkward, and she told me so. By February, they were longer. He called her on her birthday at 6 in the morning because he'd remembered she started her shift at 7 and he didn't want to miss her. She told me he asked about both kids by name. She said, "I think he's trying, Dad." I told her that's all any of us can really do. He came to Columbus in March. Drove down by himself. No wife. No agenda. He sat at my kitchen table and drank coffee for 3 hours. We talked about Carol. We talked about the routes I used to walk. He asked about Gerald, and I told him Gerald had started a small logistics consulting business and it was doing well. He asked if I thought Gerald would ever consider him a decent person again. I told him that was Gerald's answer to give, and he'd have to earn the chance to hear it. He asked if I'd ever considered not showing him what he'd done, if I'd considered just letting it go. I told him there's a difference between forgiving someone and pretending they didn't do anything that needed to be addressed. I told him forgiveness was something I was working on. But letting it go without consequence would have meant everyone who got hurt stayed hurt while he walked forward clean. I told him that's not something a father does for a son he still believes in. He looked at me across the table the way people look when something lands. He said, "You still believe in me?" I told him I wouldn't have driven to Darnell's office if I didn't. I would have just made the phone call. We sat in the quiet for a while. Outside, March in Columbus was doing what March in Columbus does, deciding between winter and spring, unable to commit. The coffee got cold. Neither of us moved to warm it up. My heart is stable. The cardiologist says the repair held, and my numbers are where they should be. I walk 3 miles every morning on the west side routes I used to carry. Sometimes the people who live there wave from their windows. A few of them recognize me. One woman on Clement Avenue told me last spring that I'd delivered her mail for 19 years and she'd always meant to say thank you but never got around to it. I told her she just did. My daughter got promoted to shift supervisor in February. Better pay, better hours, and the kind of respect you earn by doing the work without complaint for years until someone finally looks up and notices. Her kids call me every Sunday. The girl told me last month she wants to be a doctor. The boy said he wants to walk a mail route. I told them both that both things are good work done with your whole self, and that's the only kind worth doing. The envelope my daughter gave me is still in my desk drawer. I didn't spend it. I couldn't bring myself to. I kept it as evidence not of what my son did, but of who my daughter is. Evidence of what showing up looks like when it costs you something real. Terry stopped by in April. We sat on the porch and watched the neighborhood move through the evening. He asked if I was at peace with how everything had turned out. I told him I was at something. I wasn't sure it was peace. It was more like the feeling after a long route on a hard day, when you've delivered everything that needed delivering, and your feet hurt and the light is going but you're still standing, tired in the right way. He said, James would have called that earned. James was a carrier who trained both of us. Died in 2018. If he'd been alive, he'd have been first through the door at that hall. He would have brought the coffee. Some people are your family by accident of birth. Some people show up every single time life puts something in front of them and asks who's going to move toward it. I spent 64 years confusing those two categories. I spent too long assuming the first group was also the second. I know the difference now. I know it because my daughter handed me an envelope in a grocery store vest after a 40-hour week. I know it because Terry Okafor knocked on my door with cash from people who had their own bills to pay. I know it because Gerald Watts drove 3 hours in November rain to sit in a folding chair and tell his truth in front of strangers, because someone finally asked him to. I know it because my son is learning, one phone call and one kept promise at a time, that the name Callahan used to mean something, and the only way to carry it forward is to earn it back in small, consistent, unremarkable acts of showing up. That's not dramatic. It's not a ribbon cutting or a bonus announcement or a wine cellar. It's a phone call every week. It's a fund named after a woman who worked at a dry cleaner so her kids could have more than she did. It's 32 years of walking routes in the cold because you decided the mail was going to get delivered and the people waiting for it deserved that much. If you've been putting off a call you know you should make it. If you've been waiting for someone to notice what you've given, know that the right people are already keeping count. And if you've hurt someone who trusted you with their name and their credit and their belief in who you were, understand that the only way back is through what you actually do, not what you promise. Before I go, type the number 8 in the comments so I know you stayed with me to the end. And share this with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one. I'll be here.